15 hypermarket and hypercommodity from 30 kilometers all around. The arrows point you toward these large triage centers that are the hypermarkets, toward this hyperspace of the commodity where in many regards a whole new social ID is elaborated. It remains to be seen how the hypermarket centralizes and redistributes a whole region and population, how it concentrates and rationalizes time, trajectories, practices, creating an immense to and fro movement totally similar to that of suburban commuters, absorbed and ejected at fixed times by their workplace. At the deepest level, another kind of work is at issue here, the work of acculturation, of confrontation, of examination, of the social code, and of the verdict. People go there to find and to select objects, responses to all the questions they may ask themselves, or, rather, they themselves come in response to the functional and directed question that the objects constitute. The objects are no longer commodities, they are no longer even signs whose meaning and message one could decipher and appropriate for oneself, they are tests, they are the ones that interrogate us, and we are summoned to answer them, and the answer is included in the question. Thus all the messages in the media function in a similar fashion, neither information nor communication, but referendum, perpetual test, circular response, verification of the code. No relief, no perspective, no vanishing point where the gaze might risk losing itself, but a total screen where, in their uninterrupted display, the billboards and the products themselves act as equivalent and successive signs. There are employees who are occupied solely in remaking the front of the stage, the surface display, where a previous deletion by a consumer might have left some kind of a hole. The self-service also adds to this absence of depth. The same homogeneous space, without mediation, brings together men and things, a space of direct manipulation. But who manipulates whom? Even repression is integrated as a sign in this universe of simulation. Repression become deterrence is nothing but an extra sign in the universe of persuasion. The circuits of surveillance cameras are themselves part of the decor of simulacra. A perfect surveillance on all fronts would require a heavier and more sophisticated mechanism of control than that of the store itself. It would not be profitable. It is thus an allusion to repression, a signal of disorder, that is put in place. This sign can thus coexist with all the others, and even with the opposite imperative, for example those that huge billboards express by inviting you to relax and to choose in complete serenity. These billboards, in fact, observe and surveil you as well, or as badly, as the policing television. The latter looks at you look at yourself in it, mixed with the others, it is the mirror without silvering, tame, in the activity of consumption, a game of splitting in two and doubling that closes this world on itself. The hypermarket cannot be separated from the highways that surround and feed it, from the parking lots blanketed in automobiles, from the computer terminal, further still, in concentric circles, from the whole town as a total functional screen of activities. The hypermarket resembles a giant montage factory, because, instead of being linked to the chain of work by a continuous rational constraint, the agents, or the patients, mobile and disintegrated, give the impression of passing through aleatory circuits from one point of the chain to another. Schedules, selection, buying are aleatory as well, in contrast to work practices. But it is still a question of a chain, of a programmatic discipline, whose taboos are effaced beneath a veneer of tolerance, facility, and hyperreality. The hypermarket is already, beyond the factory and traditional institutions of capital, the model of all future forms of controlled socialization, redotalization in a homogeneous space, time of all the dispersed functions of the body, and of social life, work, leisure, food, hygiene, transportation, media, culture, retranscription of the contradictory fluxes in terms of integrated circuits, space, time of a whole operational simulation of social life, of a whole structure of living and traffic. A model of directed anticipation, the hypermarket, especially in the United States, pre-exists the metropolitan area. It is what gives rise to metro areas, whereas the traditional market was in the heart of a city, a place where the city and the country came to rub elbows. The hypermarket is the expression of a whole lifestyle in which not only the country but the town as well have disappeared to make room for the metro area, a completely delimited functional urban zoning, of which the hypermarket is the equivalent, the micromodel, on the level of consumption. But the role of the hypermarket goes far beyond consumption, and the objects no longer have a specific reality there. What is primary is their serial, circular, spectacular arrangement, the future model of social relations. The form hypermarket can thus help us understand what is meant by the end of modernity. The large cities have witnessed the birth, in about a century, 1850 to 1950, of a generation of large, modern stores. Many carried this name in one way or another, but this fundamental modernization, linked to that of transportation, did not overthrow the urban structure. The cities remain cities, whereas the new cities are satellite by the hypermarket or the shopping center, serviced by a programmed traffic network, and cease being cities to become metropolitan areas. A new morphogenesis has appeared, which comes from the cybernetic kind, that is to say, reproducing at the level of the territory, of the home, of transit, the scenarios of molecular control that are those of the genetic code, and whose form is nuclear and satellitic. The hypermarket as nucleus. The city, even a modern one, no longer absorbs it. It is the hypermarket that establishes an orbit along which suburbanized ego moves. It functions as an implant for the new aggregates, as the university or even the factory sometimes also does, no longer the 19th century factory nor the decentralized factory that, without breaking the orbit of the city, is installed in the suburbs, but the montage factory, automated by electronic controls, that is to say corresponding to a totally deterritorialized function and mode of work. With this factory, as with the hypermarket or the new university, one is no longer dealing with functions, commerce, work, knowledge, leisure, that are autonomized and displaced, which still characterizes the modern unfolding of the city, but with the model of the disintegration of functions, of the indeterminacy of functions, and of the disintegration of the city itself, which is transplanted outside the city and treated as a hyperreal model, as the nucleus of a metropolitan area. Based on synthesis that no longer has anything to do with the city. Negative satellites of the city that translate the end of the city, even of the modern city, as a determined, qualitative space, as an original synthesis of a society. One could believe that this implantation corresponds to the rationalization of diverse functions. But, in fact, from the moment a function becomes hyper-specialized to the point of being capable of being projected from every element on the terrain keys in hand, it loses the finality proper to it and becomes something else altogether, a polyfunctional nucleus, an ensemble of black boxes with multiple input-outputs, the locus of convection and of destructuration. These factories and these universities are no longer factories nor universities, and the hypermarkets no longer have the quality of a market. Strange new objects of which the nuclear power station is without a doubt the absolute model and from which radiates a kind of neutralization of the territory, a power of deterrence that, behind the apparent function of these objects, without a doubt constitutes their fundamental function, the hyperreality of functional nuclei that are no longer at all functional. These new objects are the poles of simulation around which is elaborated, in contrast to old train stations, factories, or traditional transportation networks, something other than a modernity, a hyperreality, a simultaneity of all the functions, without a past, without a future, and operationality on every level. And doubtless also crises, or even new catastrophes. May 1968 begins at Nanterre, and not at the Sorbonne, that is to say in a place where, for the first time in France, the hyperfunctionalization extramuros of a place of learning is equivalent to deterritorialization, to disaffection, to the loss of the function and of the finality of knowledge in a programmed neo-functional whole. There, a new, original violence was born in response to the orbital satellization of a model, knowledge, culture, whose referential is lost.